In the autumn of 2017, in the Garnet Valley of eastern Oregon, a single farm survived. This is not an exaggeration for dramatic effect. It is a statement of numerical fact, a truth recorded in the ledgers of the regional co-op and etched into the memory of the 48 farming families who called the valley home. Every other corn-producing acre, a total of 11,438 acres, was functionally destroyed. But the 112 acres of the Blackwood 100, as it had been known for generations, not only survived, they produced a yield that was 3% higher than the 5-year county average. It happened because of 200 chickens, a decision made in defiance of every expert, every neighbor, and every piece of modern agricultural advice. To understand how a flock of Rhode Island Reds defeated a multi-million-dollar chemical solution and a biblical plague of beetles, you have to go back. Not just to the spring of that year, but to 1889, when the land was first purchased and a different kind of accounting began. Let me tell you about the Blackwood 100 because the land itself is the first character in this story. It was not prime territory. It was 112 acres of second-tier soil nestled in a curve of the Garnet River, purchased for $650 an acre by Silas Blackwood's great-grandfather, a man who had more patience than money. The land was considered difficult. It had a high clay content that held water too long in the spring and baked to the consistency of brick in the summer. For 128 years, the Blackwood family had not fought the land. They had negotiated with it. They learned its moods, its weaknesses, its surprising strengths. This knowledge was not stored in digital files or on cloud servers. It was stored in a series of 7 leather-bound ledgers, the first entry dated April 3, 1889, and it was stored in the mind of Silas Blackwood. Silas Blackwood was 72 years old in the spring of 2017. He had been farming the Blackwood 100 for 54 of those years, taking over from his father when he was just 18. He was a man of medium height and profound stillness, known for 2 things: never being in a hurry and never owing the bank a dollar. His hands were a roadmap of a life's work, gnarled and calloused, but they moved with a slow, deliberate grace whether he was calibrating a seed drill or handling a newborn calf. He wore the same thing most days: denim overalls over a gray work shirt, scuffed leather boots, and a faded green cap that had long ago lost its shape. Physical description, however, misses the point of Silas. To understand him, you had to understand his relationship with time. He viewed time not as a commodity to be managed, but as an ingredient to be used. Like water or sun, it had its own properties, its own role in the final outcome. This view put him at odds with the entire direction of 21st century agriculture. The Garnet Valley in 2017 was a place of quiet desperation. The price of corn had been stagnant for 3 years, hovering at a break-even point of $350 a bushel. Meanwhile, the cost of inputs, seed, fertilizer, fuel, machinery had climbed steadily. The average farm in the valley was carrying a debt load of $450,000, most of it in operating loans from the Farm Credit Bank in Pendleton, 60 miles away. Every farmer felt the squeeze. It was a pressure to maximize, to optimize, to wring every last possible bushel from every single acre, because the margins had evaporated. A single bad year, a single pest outbreak, a single hailstorm at the wrong time, and the carefully balanced equation of debt and income would collapse. Into this environment of high anxiety walked Mark Renslow. Mark Renslow was 34 years old, had been with AgriSynth Solutions for 6 years, and was known for being the top-performing sales consultant in the Pacific Northwest region. He was not a villain. He was earnest, intelligent, and he genuinely believed in the products he sold. He had a degree in agricultural science from Washington State University and a binder full of peer-reviewed studies. He arrived at the Garnet Valley Grange Hall on a Tuesday night in March for the annual co-op meeting. He was confident, dressed in a crisp polo shirt bearing the AgriSynth logo, and he spoke the language of data. He stood before the assembled farmers, a crowd of 50 or so men and women, their faces etched with the familiar lines of worry. He clicked a remote, and a PowerPoint slide appeared on the portable screen. The slide was titled, Biosecure 7, Proactive Pest Management for a New Era. Folks, Renslow began, his voice resonating with practiced confidence. We all know the challenges. We're dealing with increasingly unpredictable weather patterns and pests that are developing resistance to older chemistries. The corn borer, the rootworm, every year it's a battle. And every year, that battle costs you yield. He paused, letting the statement hang in the air. He made eye contact with a few farmers in the front row. They nodded. He was speaking their truth. What I'm here to talk about tonight isn't just another pesticide. Biosecure 7 is a systemic. That means it's absorbed by the plant, protecting it from the inside out, from root to tassel, for the entire growing season. One application at planting. That's it. No mid-season spraying. No scouting for bugs. You apply it, and you can sleep at night knowing your crop is protected. Another slide appeared. It was a chart, a beautiful, clean bar graph showing yield comparisons. Fields treated with Biosecure 7 showed, on average, a 12% increase in yield over fields treated with traditional pesticides and a 20% increase over untreated fields. Our data, compiled from over 3,000 test plots across North America, is conclusive, Rinslow continued. Biosecure 7 offers 998% efficacy against the top 15 corn pests. It's not just a product, it's an insurance policy for your harvest. A farmer in the back, a man named Dale Abernathy who farmed 300 acres down the road from Silas, raised his hand. What's it cost? Rinslow smiled. The question he was waiting for. That's the best part. Because of the efficiency of a single application, the total cost comes out to just $7,845 per acre. When you factor in the fuel and labor you save by not having to spray mid-season, plus the proven 12% yield increase. This product doesn't cost you money. It makes you money. A murmur went through the room. It was a sound of collective relief. Here was an answer. A simple, powerful, guaranteed solution to a complex and terrifying problem. One by one, farmers got up and walked to the back of the hall where Rinslow had set up a table, signing contracts, placing orders. Felt like a revival meeting. Silas Blackwood sat at his table near the front. He hadn't moved. He had listened to the entire presentation without a word, his expression unreadable. He watched his neighbors, men he'd known his entire life, line up to sign the papers. He saw the hope in their eyes. Rinslow, finishing up with a customer, noticed Silas sitting alone. He walked over, extending a hand. Mr. Blackwood, isn't it? Mark Rinslow. I noticed you haven't placed an order. Can I answer any questions for you about the product? Silas looked at the younger man's hand, then slowly took it. His grip was firm but dry. No questions. You explained it well. Rinslow beamed. Great. So how many acres can I put you down for? We're offering a 5% discount on orders over 100 acres tonight. Silas finally looked up, his pale blue eyes meeting Renslow's. He spoke quietly, but his voice carried in the nearly empty hall. I heard your numbers. 998% effective. That's right, Rinslow said proudly. The best in the industry. And what about the 0.2%? Silas asked. Rinslow was momentarily thrown. He'd never been asked that before. Well, the 0.2%, that's a statistical margin. Nothing is 100%. But for all intents and purposes, it's complete eradication. Silas nodded slowly, as if considering this. So you kill 998% of everything. The bad bugs. And the good bugs too, I imagine. The spiders, the ladybugs, the things that eat the bad bugs. You wipe the slate clean. Exactly, Rinslow said, relieved to be back on familiar ground. It creates a sterile, optimal growing environment for the corn. Nature doesn't like a sterile environment, Silas said, more to himself than to Rinslow. She always sends something to fill it, and whatever she sends is going to be the hungriest thing, the one that can live on your poison. He let go of Renslow's hand. I'll be passing, thank you. Rinslow was stunned. Mr. Blackwood, with all due respect, that's an old way of thinking. This is science. We have the data. Silas pushed his chair back and stood up slowly. He put his old green cap on his head. He looked at Rinslow, not with anger or pity, but with a kind of detached curiosity. You're selling a guarantee. I'm interested in a system. They're not the same thing. He walked out of the Grange Hall, leaving a confused and slightly offended Mark Renslow standing by the table. That night, every single corn farmer in the Garnet Valley, from the 20-acre hobby farms to the 2,000-acre corporate operations, signed up for Biosecure 7, all except one. Silas drove home in his 1998 Ford pickup, the engine humming a familiar tune. The 15-minute drive was just long enough for him to complete the calculations in his head. 112 acres at $7,845 per acre. That was $8,78640, a line item of pure expense. He pulled into his long gravel driveway, the tires crunching, and parked next to the old barn. He didn't go inside the house. Instead, he walked to his workshop, a clean, well-ordered space where every tool had a place. He flicked on the single overhead bulb, illuminating a large workbench. From a shelf above the bench, he pulled down the 7th Blackwood ledger. The ledger was bound in dark green leather, cracked at the spine. The pages were thick, filled with his father's and his own neat, blocky handwriting. He didn't open it to a specific page. He just placed it on the bench, a heavy, tangible link to the past. He sat on a stool, staring at the ledger, for a long time. The problem wasn't just the $8,78640. It was the principle of it. It was handing over responsibility for the health of his land to a chemical in a plastic jug, to a confident young man with a PowerPoint presentation. It was an act of surrender. His grandfather, in the first ledger, had written a phrase that Silas's father had drilled into him. The farm is a body, not a machine. You don't replace a part, you heal the system. He pulled out a yellow legal pad and a pencil. At the top of the page, he wrote Biosecure 7 and under it, $8,78640. On the other side of the page, he wrote Alternative. He tapped the pencil on the pad for a minute. Then he began to write. 200 pullets. Rhode Island red, 20 weeks old. He knew a hatchery over in Baker City. They'd be about $450 each. $900. He sketched a design on the back of the pad. A mobile chicken tractor. Aframe, laitguat lamber, guair mesh. 10 feet long, 5 feet wide. Big enough for 20 birds. He'd need 10 of them. He quickly calculated the materials. Lumber, guair, screws, wheels. Maybe $150 per tractor if he bought in bulk. $1,500. Feeders and waterers. Another $500. Initial supply of supplemental feed, organic crumble. $600. He added up the column. $3,500. He stared at the number. Less than half the cost of the chemical. And at the end of the season, he wouldn't have a receipt for a spent poison. He would have 200 laying hens, a freezer full of meat, and several tons of high-nitrogen fertilizer spread exactly where he needed it. Plus the eggs. 200 hens would produce around 15 dozen eggs a day. He could sell those at the farmer's market in town. It wasn't a cost. It was a diversified investment. The next morning, he called the hatchery and ordered the chickens. Then he drove to the lumber yard and bought the materials for the coops. His grandson Leo came to help him. Leo was 19, home from his first year of college studying business. He loved his grandfather, but he saw him as a relic of a bygone era. "Grandpa, what are you doing? Everyone's using the new agri-synth stuff." Dale Abernathy said it's a game changer. Silas didn't stop measuring a 2x4. Dale's a good farmer. I hope it works for him. But chickens? In the cornfield? It's weird. What are people going to say? Silas finally stopped. He looked at his grandson. It's not about what they say. It's about what works. Your great-great-grandfather used to run hogs through the corn after harvest. This is the same idea, just a different animal, a different time. We're not growing corn. We're building soil. The corn is just the happy byproduct of healthy soil. He handed Leo the tape measure. Now, I need 10 pieces cut at exactly 47 inches. No more, no less. For the next 2 weeks, they built the 10 chicken tractors in the barn. They were simple, functional, and sturdy. When the chickens arrived in late April, a cacophony of squawking in the back of a delivery truck, the neighbors noticed. They drive by slowly, shaking their heads. Silas Blackwood had finally lost his mind. Planting season came. Silas planted his usual variety of open-pollinated corn, a strain his family had been saving and selecting for 80 years. It wasn't the highest-yielding hybrid, but it was resilient, and it tasted better. After the corn was about a foot high, he brought out the chickens. His system was one of methodical rotation. Each of the 10 chicken tractors, holding 20 birds, was placed at the end of a row. Every morning, just after sunrise, Silas and Leo would move each tractor 10 feet down the row. The chickens would pour out onto the fresh patch of ground, scratching, digging, and devouring everything in sight. Weed seeds, cutworms, beetle larvae, grasshoppers. Their droppings were tilled directly into the soil by their frantic scratching. They were a mobile, self-propelled, fertilizing and pest control unit. It was hard work. It took them an hour every morning and another hour every evening to move the tractors, check the feed and water, and collect the eggs. Meanwhile, his neighbors' fields were quiet. Their corn, genetically modified and protected by Biosecure 7, shot up, a perfect uniform carpet of green. There were no weeds. There were no bugs. There was no life at all, other than the corn itself. Dale Abernathy drove by one afternoon, stopped his truck, and watched Silas wrestle a chicken tractor into place. "Silas," he called out, leaning out his window, "you're working too hard. I sprayed once and I haven't set foot in my field since. Things on autopilot." Silas just waved. "Looks good, Dale." The summer wore on. The valley baked under a relentless sun. June turned to July. Silas's field didn't look as perfect as his neighbors'. The rows where the chickens had passed were a darker green, but there were patches here and there where the corn was shorter, where the chickens had been a little too aggressive. From the road, it looked uneven, messy. His grandson Leo was embarrassed. His friends, home from college, ribbed him about his grandfather's chicken farm. On July 17th, the first one was found. A single iridescent green beetle, clinging to a corn tassel on a farm at the far western edge of the valley. The farmer who found it didn't know what it was. He'd never seen one before. He posted a picture of it on a farming forum. The identification came back within an hour, from an entomologist at Oregon State University. It was Chryssalina aeruginosa, the emerald scourge beetle. Let me tell you about the emerald scourge beetle. It was not native to North America. It had arrived, as invasive species often do, in a shipping container, likely in a port in Washington. It had no natural predators in the Pacific Northwest. It was resistant to most common pesticides, including the entire class of pyrethroids to which Biosecure 7 belonged. And it had an insatiable appetite for one thing: corn. Specifically, the pollen and silks of tasseling corn. An adult beetle could devour the silks of an entire ear in under an hour, rendering it sterile and unable to produce kernels. A swarm could destroy a field in 48 hours. The first report was a curiosity. The second, 3 days later and 5 miles east, was a concern. By the end of the week, it was a full-blown crisis. The beetles were everywhere. They moved in shimmering green clouds that blotted out the sun. They descended on the pristine, uniform fields of the Garnet Valley like a divine judgment. And Biosecure 7 did nothing. The beetles landed on the corn stalks, crawled through the invisible chemical shield, and began to feast. The systemic poison was designed to kill things that chewed the leaves or bored into the stalk. It did nothing to a beetle that only ate the exposed silks. It was a fatal design flaw, a failure of imagination. The engineers at AgriSynth had prepared for every known enemy, but they had not prepared for a novel one. Panic swept the valley. Farmers drove their spray rigs through their fields day and night, dumping thousands of dollars of useless chemicals onto the crops. The beetles barely noticed. Mark Renslow's phone rang off the hook. He had no answers. He was a salesman, not a chemist. His data, his charts, his guarantees, they were all useless against the green tide. Silas Blackwood watched the unfolding catastrophe with a heavy heart. He could see the shimmering clouds of beetles moving across the valley floor. He could hear the desperate roar of his neighbor's sprayers at all hours. But the clouds never descended on the Blackwood 100. They would approach the edge of his property, and then, for some reason, they would veer away, seeking the easier, larger targets of his neighbor's monoculture fields. It wasn't magic. It was the chickens. For 3 months, his 200-bird army had been meticulously sanitizing his fields. They had eaten the larvae of every other insect. They had eaten the weed seeds that would have provided cover for pests. But most importantly, they created something the beetles found repellent: diversity and disruption. The constant scratching, the dust baths, the smell of the birds, the presence of active predators. It made his field an unattractive and hostile environment. It wasn't a sterile buffet. It was a functioning, complex, and defended ecosystem. A few beetles did find their way into his corn. Silas would find them in the morning on the ground, being torn apart by a gang of very interested Rhode Island Reds. The chickens, it turned out, thought the iridescent green beetles were a delicacy. The plague lasted for 2 weeks. When it was over, the silence that fell over the valley was deafening. The hum of the beetles was gone. The roar of the sprayers was gone. The fields, which a month before had been a sea of vibrant green, were now a wasteland of brown, skeletal stalks and naked cobs. The financial devastation was absolute. With no crop to sell, there was no way to pay back the operating loans. For sale signs began to sprout up like a final, bitter crop. Dale Abernathy, who had mocked Silas for working too hard, lost all 300 acres. The bank took everything. The annual co-op harvest meeting was held that year in late October. It was usually a celebratory affair. This year it felt like a funeral. The Grange Hall was packed, but the mood was somber. The co-op manager, a man named Bill, stood at the podium, his face grim. "We have to do this for the insurance and the federal disaster relief paperwork," he said, his voice heavy. "We need to go on record with the yields." He started calling out names. The responses were a litany of failure. John Carmichael, 800 acres. A voice from the back, hollow. Total loss, 0 inch. Schmidt Brothers, 1,200 acres. Maybe 10 bushels to the acre on the high ground. The rest is gone. One by one, the names were called. One by one, the story was the same. A 90% loss. A 95% loss. Total ruin. The air in the room grew thick with the weight of it all. Mark Renslow from Agrisynth had been scheduled to speak. He never showed up. A quiet investigation later revealed he had been reassigned to a desk job in Omaha. Finally, Bill the manager looked at his list. There was only one name left. He hesitated, then called it out. Silas Blackwood. 112 acres. Every head in the room turned. They had all driven past his place. They had seen the corn, standing tall and green long after their own had turned to dust. They had seen the chickens, pecking contentedly in the stubble after the harvest. But they didn't know the number. The silence in the room was absolute. It was a silence made of shame, regret, and a desperate, burning curiosity. Silas stood up. He was wearing his usual overalls, clean for the meeting. He took off his green cap and held it in his hands. He looked at Bill. Then his eyes swept over the faces of his neighbors, men and women he had known his whole life. He saw their pain. He felt no triumph, no satisfaction. Only a deep, abiding sorrow for what had been lost. Bill cleared his throat. "Silas? For the record, what was your yield?" Silas spoke, his voice quiet but clear, filling the cavernous silence of the hall. "We brought in 94 bushels to the acre." The room did not erupt. It did not cheer. It went, if possible, even quieter. The number was not a boast. It was a fact. 94 bushels to the acre. In a year of total devastation, it was a number so impossible, so far outside the realm of their own experience, that it felt like a message from another world. It was better than the county average in a good year. It was a yield achieved not with a silver bullet chemical, but with 200 chickens, a handful of homemade wooden coops, and a principle that was 128 years old. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then, Dale Abernathy, who had lost everything, slowly stood up. He walked across the room to where Silas was standing. He didn't say a word. He just stuck out his hand. Silas shook it. Then another farmer stood up. And another. Soon, there was a line of them, the broken and bankrupt farmers of the Garnet Valley, waiting not to ask for advice, not to beg for his secret, but simply to shake the hand of the man who had been right. The aftermath in the Garnet Valley was slow and painful. Over the next 5 years, nearly a third of the farms were sold off, consolidated into larger corporate holdings. But something else happened, too. A few of the farmers who managed to hang on started to change. They didn't all rush out and buy chickens. That wasn't the point. The point was the principle. The year after the beetle plague, the Garnet Valley Co-op, using its reserve funds, started a new program. It was called the Resilience Grant. It offered small, low-interest loans not for buying more acres or bigger machines, but for projects that increased the complexity and resilience of a farm. A grant was given to a farmer to plant a 30-foot wide pollinator strip of native wildflowers around his fields. Another was given to reintroduce grazing cattle into a crop rotation. Another went to a young couple to build a series of high tunnels for season extension, diversifying their income away from a single commodity crop. Silas's grandson, Leo, finished his business degree. To everyone's surprise, he didn't take a job in the city. He came home. He came home and asked his grandfather to teach him, not just how to drive the tractor but how to read the land, how to understand the ledger. The first thing they did together was build 20 more chicken tractors. Leo, with his business acumen, set up a subscription service for the eggs, delivering them to homes in Pendleton and La Grande. The Blackwood 100 brand became a local legend, synonymous with quality and, more importantly, with survival. One evening, years later, Leo and Silas were sitting on the porch, watching the sun set over a field of healthy, maturing corn. The chickens were quiet in their coops. Leo had been making entries in a new ledger, the 8th in the series. "I was reading Grandpa John's notes from the 30s, Leo said. The Dust Bowl years. He wrote about how all the farms around them blew away, but his soil stayed put because he'd been using cover crops and hadn't plowed it to death. He wrote, 'What is rigid breaks. What bends, survives.'" Silas nodded, a slow smile creasing the corners of his eyes. "That's the lesson." The story of the beetle plague of 2017 became a kind of founding myth for the new Garnet Valley. It was a story told and retold, not as a fable of one man's genius, but as a cautionary tale about the seductive danger of simple solutions to complex problems. It was a story about the difference between a guarantee and a system. A guarantee is a brittle promise made by a stranger. A system is a web of relationships, built patiently over time, that can absorb a shock. The farmers of the valley had bought a guarantee in a jug, and when it failed, the entire structure collapsed. Silas Blackwood had invested in a system, a messy, complicated, labor-intensive system involving soil, corn, chickens, and time. And when the shock came, his system did not just survive, prospered. It proved that true wealth is not measured in the yield of a single perfect year, but in the ability to produce a harvest in the worst of years. It was a lesson that had cost the valley nearly everything to learn, a lesson written not in a PowerPoint slide, but in the quiet, unyielding language of the land itself.